In the 75 years in which F1 has existed, we've seen multiple battles between drivers fighting it out for the crown of motorsport. And throughout the years, there were seasons, teams, drivers and rivalries that were particularly special, that changed the sport in one way or another, and that are worth taking a closer look. This is why, with this first video, I want to start a new series called GOAT, Greatest of All Teams. I know, very creative. And in this format, I want to talk about certain seasons, teams, rivalries and drivers that are particularly special and I want to take a closer look at. And you can also tell me your ideas for future videos in this series in the comments, and also subscribe to the channel if you already added. But now, let's start with today's video, which is about the 2008 season. It didn't feel like 2008 could be any more dramatic than the previous season, with 2007 having things like the Spygate scandal, Lewis Hamilton's outrageously good debut season, and the Drivers' Championship that went down to the last race between Hamilton, Alonso and Raikkonen. The driver market was also pretty quiet over the winter, with the only thing notable being Alonso's move back to Renault after just one season at McLaren, with Heikki Kovalainen taking his place at the working-based outfit. The only really interesting change for the upcoming season was the ban of traction control and the reduction of engine braking, making the cars more snappier and harder to handle. But apart from that, the roles were pretty much set for the upcoming season, with McLaren and Ferrari being the title favourites for the constructors, with BMW having the chance to come up from behind if they had another good season like in 2007, and Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Raikkonen, Felipe Massa and Heikki Kovalainen being pretty much the title favourites as they were in the best cars. And the season opener in Australia did none of this. Nothing. Instead, we had pure chaos. You saw multiple crashes and spins throughout the entire field, even from the reigning world champion Kimi Raikkonen, with only McLaren, or more particularly Lewis Hamilton, being able to prove their good form from the previous season by winning the opening race ahead of Heidfeld's BMW and Nico Rosberg's Williams. And all of these retirements, combined with some mechanical issues, meant that only 6 drivers would see the checkered flag for the opening race. Especially for Ferrari, this first race was an absolute disaster, because while their 2 drivers had to retire, McLaren was already able to collect some good points and build a big advantage for them for the rest of the season in the Constructors' Championship. So Ferrari had to find a way to bounce back in Malaysia, and with them getting the first row in qualifying, it looked like they had actually made it, especially with Hamilton being only able to qualify himself in P9. In the race, it looked like the 2 Ferrari drivers could actually make a use of this good qualifying result, until Massa spun out on lap 30, making it the second retirement for him at the second race of the season and 0 points after 2 races. Meanwhile, Raikkonen won the Grand Prix, with Kubica from BMW and Kovalainen from McLaren finishing on the podium, and Hamilton recovering from his P9 to P5 at the end. And especially for the BMW Sauber outfit, this was a pretty good start to the season, with them being able to secure 2 podium positions in the first 2 races. This not only meant that Heidfeld and Kubica were in a really good position in the driver's standings, but also that BMW Sauber was only 5 points behind McLaren in the constructors' standings. On the other hand, Massa really needed a good finish here, because now the Brazilian was the only one out of the top 4 drivers that hadn't scored a single point yet. So when he crossed the line first at the next Grand Prix in Bahrain, he must have felt pretty good, especially as his teammate came home second, making it the first one to finish for Ferrari in the season, and with Lewis Hamilton only finishing in P13 after he had collided with Fernando Alonso. And so after this round, both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships were pushed close together, with the top 3 in the Constructors being separated by just 2 points. Next we had 2 rather uneventful Grand Prix in Spain and Turkey, with Kimi Raikkonen coming home to win the Spanish Grand Prix, and Massa making it his 3rd consecutive win at the Turkish Grand Prix. However, next up came the prestigious Monaco Grand Prix, a race that could always bring in some drama. And when the forecast for Sunday mentioned rain, it seemed like all the ingredients were set for a historical Monaco Grand Prix. Ferrari locked out the first front row in qualifying, with McLaren taking the second, and Kubica, who by now had brought himself into a pretty good position in the driver's standings, taking home 5th. And it wouldn't take too long until the aforementioned drama would happen, even though there wouldn't be any collisions on the first lap, because in lap 6, entering the Tabac corner, Lewis Hamilton lost his car, touched the barrier with his right rear, got a puncture and earned himself a trip through the pits, which was way earlier than all the other ones that made their normal stop. However, this gave the McLaren man a chance to fuel up his car a lot for a longer second stint in order to give him an advantage for the later stages of the race. The drama on track, however, wouldn't stop, with multiple drivers going off and crashing into the barriers, causing multiple safety cars. And in one of these restarts, Massa, who had kept his lead up until now, went off at turn 1, handing the lead to Kubica, losing him vital seconds to the pole. However, for his teammate Raikkonen, the race went even worse, with him not only going off in the exact same place as Massa, but also gaining a drive-through penalty and crashing into the back of Sutil, forcing him to retire later in the race. And in the later stages of the race, the rain stopped, and the dry line formed pretty quickly, which gave Hamilton, who now had way more fuel in the car than his competitors, the comfortable position to pit at the perfect timing for dry tyres, giving him a commanding lead and the win of the race. And so this unscheduled pit stop not only gave Hamilton 10 vital points, but also the lead in the drivers' standings. Next was the Canadian Grand Prix, and a lot of people remembered the horrible pictures of Robert Kubica's enormous crash just 12 months before. But the pole didn't seem to be affected by this in any way, taking P2 in qualifying. At this point of the season, the first group of championship contenders formed, with Kubica, Raikkonen, Massa and Hamilton, and so this meant that every mistake could be vital for the championship at the end of the season. They all must have had this in mind when they rushed into the pits because of a safety car that was caused by Adrian Sutil's broken down car. This was a decisive moment of the race, as whoever would come out first of the pit lane might later win the race, and so everybody wanted to be as fast as possible at their pit stops. Hamilton led Kubica and Raikkonen into the pits, but the Finn was the fastest with his pit stop and so came out alongside of Kubica with Hamilton behind. And with the Ferrari driver coming closer and closer to the pit exit, he looked at the lights that signaled if the pit lane exit was open or not. Unexpectedly, the pit lane exit was closed, and so all the drivers had to slow down and stop and wait for the light to go green. Raikkonen saw it and slowed down, but unfortunately Hamilton didn't and crashed into the back of the Ferrari. After this collision, both of them and Nico Rosberg, who had also ran into the back of Hamilton, had to retire, causing a lot of chaos in the pit lane. This was a disaster for both of them, and the only lucky one out of this situation was Kubica, because he was able to stop in front of the red light and didn't get hit by Hamilton, going through the pit lane exit unscathed. And Kubica was able to transform that advantage into the first race win of his career, at the exact same place where 12 months before he had his monstrous crash. Meanwhile, Massa was able to finish in 5th after he had to do an extra pit stop because of refueling problems. For both of them, this meant that they could take the first 2 positions in the drivers' standings, with Kubica leading by 4 points ahead of Massa. And after a rather uneventful French Grand Prix, which was won by Massa, making it the second one to finish for Ferrari that season, we travelled to the home of motorsport, Great Britain. Here, the British fans would obviously not only cherish for their favourite team McLaren, but also for their hometown boy, for their favourite Lewis Hamilton. In qualifying, we would see an unexpected pole from Kovalainen, with Kimi coming home in 3rd, Hamilton finishing 4th, Massa coming home in 9th, and Kubica only being able to qualify just inside the top 10. And as so typical for Great Britain, the track was flooded with rain before the race. However, Kovalainen almost couldn't keep his lead coming out of the first corner, because Hamilton had a mega start, charging up the inside of 3rd and 2nd and trying to attack his teammate into turn 1 and trying to go alongside him going into Maggots and Beckett's. And it wouldn't take the Briton too long to take this lead from his teammate, as in lap 5, going into Stowe, he overtook his teammate, and from that point on, he drove an absolute masterclass of a race, because what came next was nothing short of a legendary drive, something that you will remember of a driver 10 years after their careers has passed, something like Michael Schumacher's rain drive in 1996 in Spain, or Ayrton Senna's first win in Brazil in 91. Races that go beyond the driver's career. And this drive in 2008 on a rainy Sunday in Silverstone was this. The conditions changed multiple times, from a sunny drive with just a wet track to an absolute pour down where the track got flooded so hard that no driver on track could actually try to keep it together and went off or spun just because it was impossible to drive. And so it is no surprise that 5 drivers had to retire from the race simply because they spun off under sometimes undrivable conditions on track. But despite all of this, Hamilton was still able to almost lap the entire field apart from second and third, and because Raikkonen was the only one able to score points in this race, this meant that at the halfway point of the season, we had the top 4 drivers only separated by 2 points. The German Grand Prix at the Hockenheimring would mark the start of the second half of the season, with Lewis Hamilton winning despite having a rather risky strategy, ahead of Massa in third, Kimi in 6th and Kubica in 7th, with the next race being at the Hungaroring in Hungary. Here, Hamilton was able to take pole once again, but lost it to Massa on the opening lap, with the two of them charging into the distance for the rest of the race. They were fighting against each other neck and neck, kept each other very close so that if the other one would make a mistake, for example in the pit lane, they could take the edge over the other one and take the win. And this probably would have continued until the end of the race if Lewis Hamilton hadn't experienced a puncture on his front left tyre on lap 41, forcing him into an unscheduled pit stop. Everything looked like it was set to be for the Brazilian to win his first race since the French Grand Prix, until 3 laps from the end his engine gave up and he had to retire in dramatic fashion on the start-finish straight. He had the chance to take the lead in the championship, but instead he was now 8 points behind Hamilton. His retirement allowed Heikki Kovalainen to win his first and only Grand Prix in F1, with Raikkonen coming home in third, Hamilton in 5th and Kubica only down in P8. However, Massa was able to redeem himself with a win at the European Grand Prix in Valencia 3 weeks later. Next was the Belgian Grand Prix, which looked rather uneventful, with Hamilton taking pole ahead of Massa in 2nd, Kimi in 4th and Kubica in 8th. At the start, Hamilton kept his lead while Kimi overtook his teammate for 2nd on the Kemmel Straight, with Hamilton spinning on the next lap, which gave Kimi the lead. From here on, the fight at the front would develop into a situation close to Hungary, with the only difference being that, instead of Massa, now Hamilton would fight Kimi for the win. And this will keep on until the final laps of the race, where the promised rain from the beginning of the race would now start to settle in. So for the last few laps, not only did the track more and more evolve into a slippery hell, but also the fight at the front got more and more chaotic the closer it got till the end. Hamilton seemingly got more and more impatient with the Finn and wanted to pass him on lap 42 into the final chicane, which he cut in the process but still wanted to keep fighting with the Finn. He gave back his advantage and the two kept on fighting, but by now, we are at lap 43, the track had turned into a surface that was pretty much undrivable. Almost all drivers tried to stay out on the slick tyres on this very greasy circuit that got more and more undrivable, which led to multiple drivers going off, even the two leaders of Kimi Raikkonen and Lewis Hamilton. Both of them went off multiple times during the lap, with the end to this dancing on ice with cars being that Kimi spun off and hit the wall, with Hamilton being now in a relatively comfortable lead, which meant that he would only have to slowly cruise to a victory. But surviving this hell to drive, Hamilton received a 25-second penalty after the end of the race for his action on lap 42 with Kimi Raikkonen at the bus stop chicane. This not only demoted Hamilton down to P3, but also gave Massa the win for the race, with Kubica coming home in 6th. And this also gave Massa the possibility to stay relatively close to Hamilton, while Kubica and Raikkonen had a disadvantage of almost 20 points up until this point. But despite this being a relatively harsh penalty for something like an unfair track advantage, the penalty stood and we would move on to the next race in Italy. And apparently, the rain gods didn't like that only the last few laps of the Belgian Grand Prix were hit by rain, so they decided to hit the Italian Grand Prix with almost an entire weekend of rain. So instead of having a nice and sunny weekend in mid-September at Monza, which is typical for this time of the year, you would instead get a cold and soaked weekend, which not only the fans didn't like, but apparently also the teams as well. Because to the surprise of everyone, none of the top drivers took pole, but instead a 21-year-old German called Sebastian Vettel in his rather struggling Toro Rosso. But surely he wouldn't be able to keep this lead throughout the 53 laps on a Monza racetrack throughout a race trim, right? I mean, the other top teams would still have the possibility to outdrive this kid in his rather slow Toro Rosso, right? Well, at the end of lap 53, the number 15 car, painted in dark blue with a red ball on it, crossed the finish line first, with Toro Rosso and Sebastian Vettel's first win in their career. He had done something that no one before the weekend, let alone the season, would have imagined would happen in the season. That the Toro Rosso, an ex-Minardi, would be able to fight against the McLarens and Ferraris and be even faster than them and winning a Grand Prix. But here he was, this unexperienced young German, smiling from ear to ear, and with his classic and later very often seen celebration for the first time in his career. And so everyone tried to still understand what had just happened here in Monza, as the whole circus went to a new venue in Singapore. Now, I do know that this race is special because of rather unfortunate events with the Crashgate scandal, and I do know that I also said that I would make a video about this, but I don't think that this is the right time for it, because this video is already going way too long and it would take me way too much time and make this video unnecessarily long, and I would rather like to go into the details and take more time and effort to properly go through the whole topic and especially the aftermath of it. So for now, we move on to the next race in Japan. Here, Hamilton was able to snatch pole ahead of Kimi, with Massa down in 5th and Kubica right alongside him in 6th. At the start, Hamilton went wide and forced Kimi off the track in the process, giving Massa the possibility to gain some positions. On the second lap, Massa will get himself right behind Lewis Hamilton and try to go for a move down into turn 10. And you've got to know that with only 3 races left and maximum of 30 points for offer, Massa needed to close the gap to Hamilton in order to stay in the fight for the championship, and so he had to go for moves that were rather risky, with this one being one of them. He went down the inside, tried to make the corner properly, failed, and hit Hamilton, who was sent down the order to the end of the field. Both Massa and Hamilton received penalties for their actions in the early parts of the race, with both of them being practically out for a fight for the win. This gave Kubica and Raikkonen the chance to fight for 2nd and 3rd on the podium, with the pole being the lucky one and finishing ahead of the Finn, but behind Fernando Alonso, who will get a 2nd consecutive win in the season. And because Massa and Hamilton both had bad results in the race, Kubica was still able to stay in the fight for the championship, despite still being 12 points behind Hamilton. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Raikkonen, because his 3 previous non-point scoring results meant that the Finn had lost too many points to the leader Hamilton in order to stay in the championship fight for the last 2 races. So with only 3 drivers left in the fight for the title, we moved into the penultimate race in China. However, it didn't really help that Kubica was only able to qualify a pole 12th, while Hamilton, Kimi and Massa were able to take up the top 3 finishes in qualifying. And despite being able to fight himself up to P6 again in the race, it wasn't enough, because Hamilton won the race ahead of Massa and Raikkonen, pushing the pole out of the contention for the World Championship. This meant that going into the final race, Hamilton and Massa were separated by 7 points in the Drivers' Championship, while Ferrari and McLaren were separated by 11 for the final race in Brazil. The task for the young Briton was clear: finish 5th or higher and you are the champion, even if Massa wins. However, I don't think it was Hamilton's intention to only come in 4th in qualifying while Massa took pole in front of his cheering home crowd. And apparently the rain gods hadn't seen enough wet races this season, because before this final race of the season, it absolutely started to pour down. The start of the race even had to be delayed in order to make it safe for the drivers to race. But when the track was safe to race, the championship decider began, with Massa being able to retain his lead into the first corner, with Hamilton staying in P4. But at the back of the grid, carnage happened, which led to multiple drivers retiring, and a safety car, which allowed the remaining drivers to dry up the racing line on the track while driving behind it. And when the safety car came in and racing resumed, Massa and Hamilton knew what they had to do. While Hamilton only had to stay 5th or higher, Massa not only had to win the race, but also hope that Hamilton would lose 1 or 2 positions in order to not be in the championship winning positions. The race started to settle down and get more and more to its classic rhythm, with the track drying up more and more, with the drivers going onto dry tyres at a certain point, hoping that the rain wouldn't arrive once again. When 3/4 of the race were finished, it looked like it would stay in this situation, with Massa being in the lead and Hamilton only just being able to keep his 5th place. But around 10 laps before the end of the race, the rain started to come back, forcing all the drivers into the pits once again. Hamilton and Vettel, who was right behind him and who had challenged him for 5th place for a few laps, came into the pits pretty quickly for intermediate tyres, while Massa stayed out for 2 more laps before he also went into the pits for wet tyres. So for the last few laps, Hamilton had to keep the German behind him in order to win the championship. But on lap 68, when Hamilton led through one of the lap BMW Saubers, he ran wide into the final corner, giving Vettel the possibility to pass him for 5th, dropping the Briton down to 6th and losing him the World Championship. Right at this moment, Hamilton had lost everything he had been fighting for the entire season, and he now had only 2 laps left in order to take back the place from Vettel, who was extremely quick in these conditions, in order to gain back his World Championship. But Hamilton could still hope for one thing, and that is that Timo Glock and his Toyota, who had stayed on the dry tyres, would struggle in these conditions so hard that he could pass him in the remaining 2 laps in order to gain back his important 5th position. Lap 70 began and passed. Hamilton was still in 6th and hadn't overtaken Glock by now, and now the final lap of the race, the final lap of the season had begun, and he still had to gain 1 position in order to win his championship. Meanwhile, Massa held everything together in the lead and crossed the line on lap 71 to win the race, with him hoping and praying that it would be enough in order to win him his first World Championship. Meanwhile, Hamilton was also on the final lap, and he still had to pass 1 car in order to finish in 5th. Sector 1 came, no pass. Sector 2, relatively tricky to pass here, also no pass. So he only had the final sector of the season in order to overtake 1 car for his first World Championship. He went through Mergleau and was still not able to pass Vettel, but on the horizon he saw the BMW Sauber running up into a relatively slow car. The BMW swerved to the left in order to pass this slower car, so did Vettel. But who was this? Was this another back marker he only had to lap? Or was this a real position that he would gain? Was this his so much needed 5th position that he would gain right now? He went down the inside, going alongside the slow running Timo Glock, and gained his 5th position at the last corner of the race, at the last corner of the championship, and he now only had to go full throttle to the finish line in order to win his first World Championship. And at this moment, a really bizarre situation is happening in the paddock. While in Ferrari's garage, and especially on Felipe's side, everyone is falling into each other's arms because they think they have won the World Championship, while only a few meters down the pit lane, in the McLaren pit box, everyone is starting to jump up their chairs and celebrate as well, because they now realize that Hamilton has now won the World Championship and not Massa. Hamilton came across the line in 5th place in order to win the World Championship for the first time in his career by just 1 point. And for McLaren, this was the first World Drivers' Champion they had had in their team since 1999 with Mika Häkkinen. And so the last few pictures of this legendary season were Hamilton celebrating with his team for his first F1 World Championship, while Felipe Massa was patting his chest on the podium, both being sad and extremely happy in order to win his home race in front of his crowd and being proud that he had been so close to a World Championship. And that's the video about the 2008 season completed. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about this legendary season, what moments I might have missed, and what other teams, drivers or seasons I should do in the next episode of this new format. Feel free to subscribe, like and comment the video, and until then, I'll see you next time.